In this introductory video, I'm going to give you a first look at MATLAB. I'll begin by starting MATLAB on my computer, which I can do by clicking on the MATLAB icon. You'll see that it takes a few seconds for MATLAB to start. I'm going to do several things in this video. First, I'll explain the MATLAB desktop, which is the graphical user interface that you see here. By the way, in the successive videos, you'll see slight variations in the desktop. That's because I originally made the videos in an earlier version of MATLAB, which had cosmetic differences in the desktop. The videos will gradually be redone using the latest version of MATLAB at the time of recording. Second, I'll demonstrate some simple calculations in MATLAB. For now, we're going to view MATLAB as a powerful interactive calculator. Later, we'll learn how to produce graphics and how to program in MATLAB. Third, I'll show you how to customize the desktop, and also how to set some other features in MATLAB according to your preferences. So let's begin with the MATLAB desktop, which consists of several windows. The most important is the largest window, which is the command window. This is where I enter commands and execute them. So for instance, if I enter 2 plus 2, I find that the answer is 4. You'll notice that the value of the answer is assigned to a variable called ANS, short for answer. Now look at the second window in MATLAB, the workspace window found in the lower left. This lists the variables that are currently defined in my MATLAB session. If there's enough room, the value of the variable is shown. This may not be possible for a vector or matrix variable. Currently I have one variable that's defined, that's ANS, which has value 4. I could define another variable. For instance, I could type a equals 3. Now I have two variables defined in my MATLAB workspace, and you can see both of them in the workspace window. Now I can do other calculations. For instance, I can ask what is a squared. I found out that it's 9. You'll notice that the value of ANS changed in the workspace window. Now let's do something slightly more complicated. Let's ask MATLAB to compute the square root of 2, and let's assign the value to a variable s. I find out that s is about 1.4142. I say about because MATLAB is only displaying so many digits of the answer. And I'll discuss this feature of MATLAB later. For now, let's just check. Is this really the square root of 2? I'm going to type in 2 minus s squared. If s is really the square root of 2, I should get 0. In fact, I don't get 0. I get something that's almost 0. Now to see this, you first have to understand the notation. MATLAB is displaying the answer in a form of scientific notation. E stands for exponent, and what follows the E is the exponent on the power of 10. So this number that you see here should be interpreted as negative 4.4409 times 10 to the minus 16. That number is almost 0 because 10 to the minus 16 is a very small number, but it is not exactly 0. The reason is that MATLAB works in finite precision arithmetic. Internally, it stores numbers with only a finite number of digits. This number happens to be approximately 16 decimal digits, although MATLAB, like virtually all modern computers, uses binary storage, so the number of decimal digits is not exactly 16. Next, let's look at the current folder window, which is found in the upper left. The purpose of the current folder window is to list the files in the current folder. So first we ought to ask, what is the current folder? When MATLAB needs to find a program that I've written or a data file that I've created, it will look by default in the current folder. The name of the current folder is shown in the current folder bar. That's this bar up here. When I start MATLAB on my system, the current folder is automatically sent to documents/MATLAB. So here it is, my home directory /documents/MATLAB. Since I personally don't store my work in that folder, I'm going to change the current folder to one called my mfiles, which, as you'll see, is a subfolder in my folder tree. Now that I've changed folders, you can see a list of files in the My mfiles folder. Now let's talk about customizing the desktop. If I select the Layout button in the toolbar, I see several options for changing the appearance of the desktop. First of all, note that if I change the desktop, I can always go back to what you currently see by choosing Default. 3-column displays the 3 windows you currently see, but in a different layout. All but command window minimized gives the results you see here. The command window occupies most of the desktop, but I can still hover over the name of one of the other windows to see it. So for instance, I can hover over the current folder window, and I see that. Or I can hover over the workspace window, and I can see that. Finally, my personal favorite is command window only. I personally don't find the other windows useful, so I prefer to use all of the space for the command window. From now on in these videos, I'll use the command window only option. You might think I've lost some information by hiding the other windows, but there's a command called whos that lists all the variables in the current workspace, so I can see the variables if I want to. Similarly, there's a command called what that lists the files in the current folder. I find this more useful than the current folder window. Now I want to point out another feature of the MATLAB desktop. When I'm working in MATLAB, I often find that I want to either recall or re-execute a command that I executed earlier. Rather than retyping the entire command, I can type the first characters of the command and then push the up arrow. So for instance, if I just type the character S and push the up arrow, you see that a pop-up appears that shows me the command history and selects the most recent command that begins with that character. I might want to do this, for instance, if I want to compute the square root of 3 instead of the square root of 2, and I don't want to retype the command. I can recall the previous command, make the change, and then execute it. This is especially useful when the earlier command is very long. Now, I personally don't like the pop-up window, although I do find the ability to recall earlier commands to be invaluable. If I go to the layout window and choose command history, I can then choose closed. And now if I use the up arrow, I can recall the earlier commands one at a time, but I don't see the pop-up window. If I push the up arrow without first typing any characters, all earlier commands are recalled one at a time. Let me introduce two other ways you can customize the MATLAB display. One has to do with the way MATLAB displays numbers. If we go to the Preferences button on the toolbar, we see a large number of preferences that can be edited. I'm going to ignore almost all of them, but I do want to show you a couple found under Command Window. Numeric format gives a choice of how to display numbers. The default is the short format, which means that 4 digits to the right of the decimal point are displayed. We can choose the long format. Now when we ask for the value of S, we see many more digits. We could choose short E, which now means that scientific notation is used. So for instance, here's the value of S over 100. We see the exponent explicitly. And of course, we can choose long E if we want to use exponential notation, but with many more digits. There are several other options which I'll let you explore if you want to. The important thing to remember is these are purely display options. They have nothing to do with how MATLAB computes numbers, but only with how MATLAB displays the results. One other point about the MATLAB display, you'll notice that when MATLAB displays the commands you type in the resulting output, it puts in these blank lines. So for instance, here I ask for S over 100, I get a blank line, answer equals a blank line, the result, and then yet another blank line. If I go to the Preferences button and choose Numeric Display Compact instead of Loose, MATLAB will no longer display those blank lines. Personally, I prefer the compact setting because I can see a lot more output on my screen. In the Preferences menu, you see that the alternative to compact is loose. Finally, I can change these formatting options by typing commands instead of using the Preferences menu. For instance, I can type format short to change the numeric display, and then type format short E to change it again. Similarly, I could type format loose or format compact. From now on, I'm always going to use format compact, and I'll generally use format short E. Now let's perform some other calculations. Let's start with this. Suppose I set A equal to 2, B equal to 1, and C equal to -1, and I compute x equals negative b plus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2 times a. And I get 1/2 in scientific notation. Hopefully you recognize what I'm doing. I'm applying the quadratic formula to compute one of the roots of the quadratic equation ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So if I calculate with this value of x, the expression a times x squared plus b times x plus c, I should get 0. And I do. Now you might be dissatisfied with the way the commands are entered in MATLAB because I had to take 4 or 5 lines just to do this relatively simple calculation. We can make things more compact by entering several commands on one line. In this case, I separate the different commands by commas. So a equals 2 b equals 1, c equals -1. Now remember that I can recall a previous command by just typing the first character and pushing the up arrow. So let me compute x again. Here's something else I can do. Let me recall this previous command and change the commas to semicolons. The effect is to suppress the display of the output. The commands have the same effect, but there's just no display. I can add any command in a semicolon to suppress the display. On the other hand, when I want to see the display, I omit the semicolon. Let's recall that I can use the whos command to see the variables in my workspace. If I want to clear the workspace, that is, remove all the variables, I can use the clear command. Now I see that there are no more variables. I also might want to clear the display in the command window. The clc command does this. Now let's move on to do some other calculations. Suppose I want to compute the inverse sine of 3/4. My first question would have to be, what's the inverse sine function in MATLAB? To answer this question, we can use the search documentation bar at the upper right of the MATLAB desktop. For instance, if we type in inverse sine, we see that there are several related MATLAB functions. The first, a sine, is probably the one we want. As the documentation indicates, this gives the answer in radians. If for some reason we want the answer in degrees, we can use a sine d. We can also access the documentation in a couple of other ways. First, if I search for inverse sine and click on the option that I'm interested in, the documentation browser comes up. This gives the full documentation on the a sine function. In the left column of the documentation browser, I can choose categories of MATLAB functions to explore. For instance, I can see all the trigonometric functions if I want. There they all are. Or I could look at all the elementary math functions. Or I could look at all the functions related to mathematics, which is a considerable list. If I want, I can access this browser directly by going to the Resources button on the toolbar, choosing Help, and then choosing Documentation. For now, you'll want to start in the documentation browser by choosing MATLAB. Then again, you see a number of categories for which I can request help. For instance, if I wanted to get help about graphics commands, I could choose that, and it gives me several directions in which I can go. If I remember the name of the MATLAB function that I want but need to be reminded of the details, I can just type help function name at the MATLAB prompt. Let's talk about another issue. Suppose I want the inverse sine of 3. Now actually, if you remember your trigonometry, you'll know that the inverse sine of 3 is undefined. At least it's undefined if I'm expecting a real number as the result. In fact, the inverse sine of 3 can be defined as a complex number, and that's what MATLAB computes. So here you see how MATLAB displays complex numbers. In particular, notice that MATLAB uses the built-in variable I as the square root of -1. What other built-in constants does MATLAB have? Well, it has a built-in constant called pi. How to explain the results that I just showed you? Well, first of all, the sine of pi is exactly equal to 0. Whereas the sine of pi over 2 is exactly equal to 1. You see that in fact, for sine of pi, MATLAB returns something very, very close to 0, but not exactly equal to 0. Whereas for the sine of pi over 2, MATLAB returns exactly 1. This can be attributed to the vagaries of finite precision arithmetic. The exact result of a finite precision calculation, especially if it's at all complicated, is a little bit unpredictable. Now you might expect MATLAB to have a built-in constant e, but it doesn't. If I want to know the value of e, I have to use the natural exponential function, exp. So exp of 1 is the number that we call e. I should also point out that the natural logarithm function is called log, log. You might expect log to be log base 10, but it isn't. Here you see the log of the natural exponential of 1 is 1. If I want the log base 10, I have to actually type log 10. Let me close with one more shortcut. If you want to know about the elementary functions but you don't want to use the function browser, you can type help lfun for elementary functions. There you will see a long list of all the elementary math functions in MATLAB. This ends our first look at MATLAB. I'll close by showing you how to exit MATLAB. You can type either quit or exit at the MATLAB prompt. The two are equivalent, and either one will cause MATLAB to terminate.